Story number 1. One of the things I had to do while growing up was help on our family farm during the summer. I had much more work, but I didn't mind. I liked being outside and doing something that helped the whole family. Besides, farm work could be hard, but it also helped a lot in staying fit. So from a young age, I started getting quite strong quickly. This happened when I was about 12 years old, mainly. I remember that summer because it was a very hot summer. I've always liked hot summers more than cold winters because there were many more things to do. I hated being stuck inside the house in winter, only able to go out for short periods. However, this summer was extremely hot, and this happened before anyone talked about things like global warming. My father had heat exhaustion several times that summer, and whenever that happened, all the kids had to help a lot more. One morning, we noticed that one of the scarecrows had fallen. We kept them well secured, so this almost never happened. My father was going to fix it after taking care of a few other chores, but it was another hot day, and he ended up getting overheated again. So my mother kept him inside the house, at one point against his will, and I decided I would take care of the scarecrow. The scarecrows were elevated off the ground so they could be seen when the corn grew very tall. This was the end of summer, so the corn was quite tall. I took the wooden ladder over and did my best to lift the scarecrow back up so I could secure it again. It wasn't particularly heavy, but it was quite awkward to lift it so high. While I was fixing the scarecrow, I felt like a stone or something had been thrown at me from somewhere behind me. It hit my back. I turned, expecting to see one of my brothers in the field, but there was no one there that I could see. So I thought it was nothing important and went back to what I was doing. It only took a few moments until I was hit by something again. This time, it hit me on the back of the head, and it really hurt. I started calling out the names of my older brothers, thinking they were doing this, and told them to leave me alone. However, no one responded, and there was no giggling. Normally, my brothers would laugh a lot when they were teasing me. The third time this happened, I was very annoyed. A stone had hit me on the back of the head again, and this time it made me bleed. So I told my brothers to stop, or I would tell Dad that they were interrupting the work on the farm. None of my brothers would continue after that because they were too afraid of the beating my father would give them. But then I looked and saw someone standing in the cornfield. I couldn't see very well since he was hidden in the middle of the corn, but I could tell it wasn't one of my brothers. I could see part of his face, and he looked sick, like a depraved maniac, just by the expression on his face. He was about 10 meters from me and was the strangest person I had ever seen. It only took one movement in my direction to make me run. I jumped off the ladder I was on and started running as fast as I could out of the field. It wasn't easy, but it had to be hard for the other guy too. Besides, I was young and in great shape, so I managed to get out of the field and run to where one of my brothers was doing some work. I told him what had happened and that the man was chasing me. My brother, Ayat, was 19 years old and a big muscular farmer. He always carried a pocket knife with him, and he took it out while he went to look. For a moment, we both saw the guy standing at the edge of the cornfield. Even my brother stopped when he saw the man's strange appearance, but we only saw him for a brief moment before he turned and ran back into the field. My brother chased him. I think he was going to give the guy a good beating, but the man managed to escape him. Ayatu took care of the scarecrow because I wouldn't go back there for anything. He also searched more for the guy, couldn't find him. Story number 2. Many years ago, a friend and I were on a motorcycle trip across the country. It was our favorite way to travel, but it had its drawbacks. One of them was that riding in the rain was extremely uncomfortable. Sometimes the rain from storms hit us with such force that it felt like knives cutting into our bodies. On that day, we were aiming to cover a lot of miles. The sky was overcast with dark and greenish clouds. At noon, it almost looked like night, though it hadn't started raining yet. We decided to make the most of it and travel as far as we could before the rain began. Since we were heading in the same direction as the storm, we managed to cover quite a distance that day, even riding for a while after the rain started. However, it soon became too hazardous to continue. We took the first exit we saw and found a motel. There wasn't much else at that exit, and the motel seemed quite rundown, but it was inexpensive. Given our situation, we couldn't be picky. There was a fast food restaurant across the street. After getting the room key, I went to grab some food while my friend went to the room. He had done all the driving, so I wanted to contribute in some way. The restaurant wasn't crowded, but there was a man who kept staring at me from the moment I walked in, gave me a big, unsettling grin, and I returned it with a polite smile. But he didn't stop watching me the entire time I was there. At one point, he even came over and asked if he could buy me a coffee. I politely declined and made it clear that I was in a hurry to get back to my motel room. When I left, he followed me outside the restaurant and watched me as I crossed the street back to the motel. I'd feel his gaze with every step I took. I even looked back when I was unlocking my room door, and he was still standing outside, watching me. I felt much better once I was inside the room. By that time it was already night, but it had been dark all day. My friend was exhausted and decided to go to sleep, so I watched a bit of TV in the dark since I was still awake. After a while, I heard a noise. First, I wasn't sure what it was, but I realized it was coming from the door. This was an old motel with standard doorknobs. It sounded like someone was trying to turn the doorknob from the outside. If you've ever heard a doorknob rattling from the other side, you know what I'm talking about. I stayed still and didn't wake my friend. I waited to see what would happen. Could have been someone heading to the wrong room. Once the noise stopped, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, through the window. I hadn't closed the curtains. The unsettling man from the restaurant was peering through the window, watching me from outside. He didn't leave when he saw me. Instead, he licked the window in a way that he might have thought was seductive. But it was just creepy and alarming. I screamed and woke my friend. He saw what was happening, and the disturbing man finally noticed him. Couldn't have known I wasn't alone until then. But when he saw my friend's size, clearly got scared and fled. My friend, irritated, ran to the door, opened it, and yelled at the man, but didn't chase him or anything. I don't understand some people and how they think that frightening behavior is somehow attractive. Story 3. This is a difficult story to tell for several reasons. First, I was very young at the time, so my memory isn't the clearest. My parents have recounted this story many times to refresh my memory, but each one has their version, and even among themselves, the details differ. Second, the reason will be revealed at the end of the story. When I was 6 years old, I was a boy very attached to my mother. I followed her everywhere and constantly sought her attention. This behavior continued throughout her life. At that time, my cousin Ethan came to live with us. He had lost his parents in a fire, and his mother was my mother's sister, so she took him in. Ethan's arrival changed everything dramatically. Ethan barely spoke, which is understandable for a child who has just lost their parents. Moreover, he had lived in the city and we lived in the countryside, far from other houses. I imagine he had friends in the city with whom he used to play, but here he was isolated. I was the only child he could play with, but Ethan wasn't interested. He didn't want to go outside with me, climb trees, or play games. Instead, he was extremely attached to my mother, which deeply frustrated me. I wanted all her attention, and Ethan was always around, often holding on to her skirt as if trying to prevent her from leaving. Whenever we tried to make Ethan stop, he would start crying and shouting. It was easier to let him do as he wished. This left me feeling very irritated. Although I was too young to explore the forest, it was the only thing I had to do. One particularly strange day, I decided to explore the forest. Being outside was more pleasant than I had anticipated, despite the sky being covered with dark storm clouds and the threat of an impending storm. The wind, occasional lightning, and thunder created an intense atmosphere. Initially, I was excited to be alone, but when I decided to return home, I realized I was lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but hadn't paid attention to any landmarks, so I didn't know how to find my way out. My young mind convinced me that if I walked the same distance I had walked into the forest, I would eventually find my way out. However, this plan didn't work, and the storm seemed to be growing closer. Although I wasn't afraid of storms, I had never been in one before. and the idea of being caught in it scared me. Fortunately, the rain had not started yet, which was a relief. The longer I spent lost, the more I feared I would never find my way back. I worried about wild animals like lynxes and coyotes that we knew were in the area. Even though I found a stream and drank some water, my young mind was convinced that I would die there. Then I saw something in the distance. Smoke. Immediately, I thought that someone, possibly my father, had started a fire to help me find my way back. With renewed hope, I headed towards the smoke. However, as I got closer, I was devastated to see the reality. The house where I had lived all my life was engulfed in flames. It wasn't a small fire. The entire house was completely consumed by the blaze. I stood in the forest, staring at the most horrifying scene I had ever witnessed. I didn't know what to think until I saw my family in the yard. My parents were there, and Atan was beside my mother, as always. I ran out of the forest and straight towards my parents. My mother embraced me, relieved to see me. She had thought I was hiding somewhere in the house and was terrified, fearing I might be dead. The firefighters arrived, but there was little they could do. The house had burned down to its foundations. The official report was that the fire was accidental, but to me it seemed like a strange coincidence. Etan's parents had died in a fire less than 3 months earlier, and now our house had burned down. Even though I was too young to fully understand at the time, I couldn't help but think Etan might have been involved. My grandmother took him in and essentially adopted him after the fire. I only saw Etan when we visited my maternal grandmother. I was relieved when he left, and no other house caught fire after that. Perhaps I was wrong about him, but the doubt remains. Story 4. When I was growing up, I was essentially an only child living with my mother. My parents were not together, and I'd rather not go into details about that. Although my mother never had other children, my father eventually had a son and a daughter. So I ended up with 2 half-siblings who were approximately 8 and 10 years younger than me. Occasionally, I would do things with my father, like spending a week or more with him from time to time. It was nice to see my brother and sister grow up, and sometimes we would go on hikes and camping trips, which was always enjoyable. Well, not always. There was one time when it wasn't enjoyable at all. That's the story I'm about to share. We had what you might call a near-miss experience. Our campsite was set up on a sandbar by the river. I was 16 at the time, my brother was 8, and my sister was 6. We set up 3 tents on the sandbar, one for my father, one for me, and one for my siblings to share. We planned to stay there for a few days and try our luck fishing in the river. Everything was well organized. My father and I gathered firewood and made a good fire, getting some coals ready to start cooking the fish we had caught. Fishing was an activity that all 4 of us could participate in, even though it was usually just my father who caught anything worth eating. It seemed a bit wasteful to cook small fish. While we were cooking, we heard something coming from down the river. It took a while, but we noticed a boat approaching us. People on the boat were being very loud and rowdy even before they got close. My father and I realized they must have been quite drunk. As they got nearer, we saw they were all college students. When they noticed us, they started waving and stuff, and then steered the boat towards our sandbar. They anchored their boat a little upstream from where we were camping. At first, I thought they would set up their own camp and wouldn't involve us. How wrong I was. There were 2 couples and a guy alone. All of them were drunk and maybe high as well, but the guy alone was the drunkest of them all. I couldn't understand how he could stay upright, given how intoxicated he was. They were playing loud music and still acting rowdy. They brought a speaker and their beer and eventually came over to our campfire. They joined us, and we didn't say anything. My father was in his 40s, and I was 16, but we knew we needed to be cautious around a bunch of drunk students. Alcohol can change a person dramatically. My father and I talked with them, mostly to keep them happy. After a while, one of the couples asked to borrow one of our tents. Before anyone could say anything, I offered mine. I had a good idea of why they wanted the tent, and I figured it would be better to offer mine before one of my siblings offered theirs. The other 2 couples were so drunk that I wondered how they didn't pass out. Their eyes kept closing, and they swayed a bit but never completely collapsed. The lone guy, who was even more intoxicated, was the most frightening. He had a large hunting knife strapped to his belt, and I kept a close watch on him in case he decided to use it. He even took out the knife, and I was about to do something. He moved away from us. There was a tree stump on the edge of the sandbar, and he went over there, repeatedly throwing the knife at it. My father had a filleting knife for the fish. It was the sharpest knife I had ever seen. He kept it hidden the whole time. I took the axe we used to chop firewood and kept it close by. I decided I knew what I needed to do. I went to the tents and took out the sleeping bags from all of them. I wish I had taken mine out before letting that couple enter it. But anyway, I moved all the sleeping bags into my father's tent. We all were going to sleep there. My siblings were confused because I don't think they understood what was happening. They complained because they wanted their own tent, but I made them stop. The 5 students then decided to play in the water, swimming and such. Some of them started swearing, and 2 of the guys, the single one and one of the couples, began to fight a bit. I don't know how bad the fight was. I was trying to pay as little attention as possible. We all just went to our tent when it was dark enough. We had lights for reading, but it was very difficult with the loud music, shouting, swearing, and who knows what else going on outside. At one point, we noticed shadows. 2 of the students had come quite close to our tent and seemed to be fighting again. I still had my axe and was fully prepared to use it if necessary. One of the guys stumbled and almost fell into the tent but managed to catch himself. Somehow, my brother and sister managed to fall asleep, but my father and I stayed awake, listening for hours as they partied, argued, swore, fought. Eventually, around 4 in the morning, I heard the boat starting up and pulling away. I finally managed to get a bit of sleep. When we woke up in the morning, we noticed that one of our coolers had been thrown into the fire, and the other 2 tents had been trampled and were dented. Thankfully, that was all they did, and none of us were hurt. You never know what people will do when they are intoxicated. I'm not judging. After all, later in my life, I partied more than they did, and that was just a few years later. Well, that was one of the scariest nights I've ever experienced. Story 5. It was a cool spring afternoon in a small town called Millville, Missouri. Although there were no tornadoes nearby, the winds seemed to suggest otherwise. The forecast predicted strong winds, hail, and heavy rain for the late afternoon and evening, which hadn't occurred yet. Most of the freshly plowed soil was at risk of being lifted into the air. Still, the strong winds created a mist, especially as the farmland remained unsown, as it was too early in the planting season. The planting would begin soon, but for now, nature, with its rain, rejected any notion of human intervention and showed no signs of wanting to be left to its own whims. A light mist lingered in the air, and even with a few scattered raindrops, a tiny droplet, so light I almost didn't feel it, fell right between my eyebrows. When I smiled, my gray eyes scanned for any signs of a downpour, but none appeared in the single cloud above that briefly blocked the sun before moving on. We knew it wouldn't last because, in the distance, we heard the low rumble of thunder, signaling intense rains and a clash of dark, heavy clouds colliding, churning, and rolling. My sisters Viola, Linda, and I were heading to McGrudd's Country Market to buy food for Thomasina, my cat. The market was a few miles from our mobile home, located in a plot in the middle of a small town in Missouri. We and the locals, called Misery. We chatted a bit about what the weather might bring, though it seemed the seasonal rains had other plans. With the intention of enjoying ourselves despite the dust from the wind, the splashes, and the birds seeking shelter, we did just that. While I was leading my mare Zandy with a single rein around her gray-silver nose, she danced beside me and snorted occasionally as the wind suddenly changed direction, swirling around us like a mini tornado, raising more debris and dust, and mixing Zandy's long white, golden, and dark gray mane with my own blonde hair. She nudged my free left arm from time to time to see if I was paying attention to her. Her large brown eye kept a close watch on me. Her soft muzzle brushed gently against my arm a second time, and I knew what she wanted. So I reached into the simple cloth bag I was carrying to bring some treats from the market for my 2 younger sisters and for Thomasina, and pulled out a piece of apple I had cut before we left for our walk. She whinnied and took the apple, chewing it happily, and gently nudged my arm again to say thank you. "Cat, I love you." I knew she was a bit spoiled, but who cares? She was mine, and I was hers. So that was all that mattered. She knew that too, and took every opportunity to make sure everyone around us knew it. When I kissed the velvety softness of her muzzle, she nibbled my cheek with her lips. I could feel the sweetness of her apple-scented breath as I petted her neck and turned to catch up with my two sisters, who had moved ahead on the dirt road. The wonderful smell of horse mixed with the scents, freshly plowed earth, recently fallen rain, and the sound of our footsteps and hooves blending with the intermittent gusts of wind gave my young one a kind of excited contentment that only youth knows and that the older ones long to experience again. At that moment, I had everything I had always wanted, or that would one day matter to me. But that perfect moment would soon be taken from my mind as the wind picked up and the unusually intense electrical storm approached. "Let's go, Cat, dear," Viola called. "We have to go. The storm is coming." I know, I agreed. "I'm coming." And I began to walk faster, moving closer to my two sisters and positioning myself between them. I felt Sandy's fur tremble and noticed she was a bit nervous as the sky started to darken. The wind increased further, blowing dust around us. Sandy snorted and moved further to the left, almost brushing against my sister Viola, who raised her hand and touched her lightly to prevent her from moving forward. Instantly, Sandy returned to walking beside me, as if she was following a command. "Good girl," Viola said, and then added, "Why is she so nervous?" "I don't know. Maybe the storm," I said, knowing that Sandy's behavior seemed to indicate she was sensing something that the rest of us couldn't. Once again, she veered to the left, moving away from the field to the right. Suddenly, as if a voice was calling our names, including hers, Sandy turned her head in unison with ours, and together we waited to see some monstrous being in the distance, just above the horizon, somewhere in the southern sky. Our reaction was one of anticipation for something horrible that might emerge somewhere in the storm. Even Sandy's neighing was quieter, but all we saw was a sudden web-like lightning bolt in the distance. Although it was not close to where we were, we could still smell the crackling ozone as if it had just come up from the ground. A little frightened by the possibility of being struck by lightning, we walked faster. Sandy needed no encouragement and kept pace with me, and then, once again, moved ahead of me as if to say, "Hurry up, thickhead." She almost tore the reins from my hand because I always held them loosely, never needing to control her so tightly. Sandy always seemed to know what I wanted and did it with just a word from me. But now, she was leading and couldn't be persuaded to slow down. I couldn't blame her. There was something in the air that was unsettling, and it was more than just the storm. Linda also seemed frightened as she looked at me and then at the darkening sky. "I'm scared, Cat," she said, but not with words, just with the fear in her eyes. I too struggled to stay calm, even though she and Viola were older. Linda had been slightly mentally debilitated by a case of scarlet fever when she was 5 years old. The illness had marked her mind in such a way that at times she didn't need help making decisions, and even refused help. But at other times, she could be easily manipulated into doing things others wanted. Our mother understood early on that we needed to keep an eye on Linda so that no one could trick her into doing something she shouldn't. But she still did things just to please others. When I stopped, keeping an eye on Linda, I saw that she had also stopped. But Sandy didn't want to stop until I pulled the reins more firmly. When she finally stopped, she stomped nervously on the ground, raising more dust in the air. "It's okay," I murmured, stroking and smoothing her neck, which was gray, black, and pink-spotted, as she began to calm down. The strong smell entered our noses, and we took a deep breath together. "Come here, Linda," I said. Immediately, she was by my side, needing no further call. "Come on, get on Sandy. She'll help calm you." As I was starting to help Linda mount Sandy, who was facing the same direction we had seen the lightning, I suddenly had a recollection and felt, without reason, a sudden shiver of fear travel up my spine, starting from my calves and moving up through my thighs and back. It's the sound of my sister Viola's voice. "Thank you for watching until the end. If you survived this experience, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will chill you to the bone. Comment below with your thoughts and share with your friends, if you dare. And remember, not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Until next time, if you dare to return.